It always started in the kitchen, their kitchen all gleaming marble and stainless steel, a stage for my mother-in-law Carol to perform her perfection id, be helping or trying to carrying a platter of cheese and crackers. No, Alina, not like that shed, say her voice a sugary syrup, that didn't quite hide the sharpness underneath shed. Rearrange the crackers id just laid out. We want it to look intentional. And my husband David would just smile apologetically from across the room, a silent plea in his eyes for me to just let it go. Mark's laughing face and id get back to work. Would close my eyes, and I would picture them id picture her sister's smug smile id hear her father's dismissive tone. And it was like a jolt of electricity. It was the purest form of motivation I've ever known. It wasn't about positive thinking, it was about defiant doing. Building my company was like building a new version of myself brick by brick. Every employee I hired felt like a personal victory interviewing them. I looked for more than just skill, I looked for spirit. I looked for people who had been underestimated, who had a fire in them. And when I offered them the job, and they accepted it, was a silent message to my past self. It was proof that I was capable, that I was worthy of leading, that my ideas had value. The office grew from a cramped room to a full floor and then to a building with our name on it. That name, my name, which they used to say with a kind of pity, was now on a building in the city center that wasn't just success, it was a monument to resilience. Years went by, the company thrived, the invitations to family events became less frequent, or maybe I just stopped accepting them. I heard through my wife that they were following my progress with what sounded like a mixture of disbelief and a reluctant, grudging respect. Then the email arrived. It was from HR, a list of applicants for a new senior position. And there it was, both names, her sister and her husband. My first reaction was a cold shock, then a surge of something dark and primal, the old shame, the old anger flashed for a second. The thought of revenge was undeniably sweet. I could imagine the power I would have sitting across from them, making them squirm. I could reject them with a wave of my hand. I could give them a taste of the powerlessness they once made me feel. But as I sat there staring at their names on the screen, that feeling passed. It was replaced by something else, something quieter. It was pity, not the condescending kind they had shown me, but a genuine understanding of their limitations. They were still the same people chasing status, trying to attach themselves to success. They saw my company as a trophy, a thing to be acquired. They hadn't changed. But I had the desire for revenge, felt small beneath me. It belonged to the man I used to be. The man I was now didn't need it. I told HR to schedule the interviews. I wanted to see them, not to gloat, but to confront the past, to face the ghosts head-on and prove to myself that they had no power over me anymore. The day of the interviews, I dressed carefully. I didn't want to look like I was trying too hard. I just wanted to be me, the CEO. Seeing her sister walk into my office was surreal. The confidence she used to wear like armor was gone. It was replaced by a nervousness she tried to hide. But I could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly as she handed me her resume. She was trying to be charming, to use the same familiar tone she might have used at a family dinner. But her eyes kept darting around the room, taking in the floor-dociling windows, the art on the walls, the quiet hum of authority. She was on my turf. Now the power dynamic had completely flipped. I asked her questions about her experience, but I was really observing her. I saw the moment she realized the full extent of what had happened. It wasn't just that I was successful, it was that I was completely at ease in this role, in this skin. The accent she once mocked was now the voice of the person who held her future in his hands. I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes, not just for applying for the job, but for everything. She saw the journey in my face, and she understood her part. Slowly, painstakingly, Alara Solutions grew. We filled a genuine need in the market. Our reputation was built on precision and reliability. We went from a one-woman operation to a team of 10, then 50. We moved from my spare bedroom to a proper office downtown. I was interviewed in business magazines. Alara Vasquez, the disruptor with a vision. They never used a photo of my family. They never mentioned David's last name to the business world. I was just Alara, the CEO. In it. When her husband came in, it was even more pronounced. He was always the loud one, the one who dominated conversations. Now he was meek. He kept calling me sir. He stumbled over his words. He was trying to sell himself. But all I could see was his vulnerability. The bravado was a thin veneer in that moment. Any lingering anger I had evaporated. They were just people, flawed and afraid, just like everyone else. The interview became a strangely therapeutic moment. It was the closing of a circle. I was facing the source of my deepest pain, but I felt no pain, I felt a calm, detached clarity. After they left, I sat alone in my office for a long time. The choice was mine. I could reject them and savor the victory, or I could do something else. The truly empowering act I realized wasn't in wielding power over them. It was in offering them an opportunity, not because they deserved it, but because I was secure enough to do so. It would be an offer without condescension, without any strings attached. It would be a simple business decision. If they were the best candidates, they would get the job. If they weren't, they wouldn't. My judgment would be clean, unbiased by the past. That was the ultimate freedom, to be able to look at them, not as tormentors, but as individuals, and to make a decision based on merit alone. That is a power that revenge can never give you. In the end, they weren't the right fit. The roles required a kind of grit and humility they simply didn't possess. I had HR send the standard rejection letters. There was no personal message, no final dig, it was just business. Reflecting on this whole journey, I see it clearly now. Their mockery was the necessary obstacle. It was the friction that created the heat. And the heat that forged the steel. Without them, I might have remained comfortable in that mediocre job, always trying to fit in, always dimming my own light. To make them more comfortable, they gave me the gift of adversity. And in overcoming it, I found a strength I never knew I had. True success, I've learned, isn't just about the money or the title on the door. Those are just byproducts. The real success is emotional freedom. It's the ability to look at the people who hurt you and feel nothing but a distant understanding. It's the power to lift others up, not because you want something from them, but because you remember what it feels like to be down. My in-laws taught me how to be small, and in doing so, they forced me to learn how to be great. The greatest victory was never making them kneel. It was realizing I no longer needed them to. You have to understand, my in-laws Bernard and Margaret have always operated like a two-person comedy roast team, where I am the only guest of honor. And the jokes are all at my expense. Bernard, a man built like a stubborn oak tree, critiques everything from the way I grill a burger, a bit daring with the pink in the middle, errant veto the political opinions he assumes I hold. And Margaret, oh, she's the wordsmith. She once spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner gently mocking the way I say water, not with a. And through it all, the family remained blissfully, arrogantly oblivious. Our gatherings continued. The comments about my accent became less frequent, but they never truly stopped. It was more condescending now. How's your little computer project? Alina Carroll would ask, as if I was building a website for a hobby. Mark, who worked in middle management at a large manufacturing firm, would offer unsolicited advice about the real business world, never once asking what my company actually did. I'd just smile. Hard tea, you see. Apparently I say water. She must have repeated it back to me a dozen times. Could you pass the water, dear? Oh, this water is so refreshing. I sat there smiling tightly, while internally I was crafting the perfect scathing retort about the fact that she pronounces niche like niche. But of course I never said it. Those perfect comebacks always arrive about 3 hours later in the shower. My spouse Sarah, during these episodes, develops a sudden intense interest in the pattern on the dinner plates, or will desperately try to change the subject to something, anything else. So Mom, how about this? Weather unusual for this time of year, isn't it? And Bernard would just grunt and say the weather is fine, it's the barbecue sauce that's the real tragedy. Sarah would give me this look, a mixture of apology and shared agony. We had a whole silent language for these occasions. A slight tilt of the head meant I am so sorry, a quick eyebrow raise meant just nod and smile, and a subtle kick under the table meant for the love of all that is holy, do not engage. The real kicker was how they'd talk about their own careers. Bernard, retired from a long life in Middleville management, would hold court on the principles of real leadership, implying that my job in, as he vaguely put it, tech stuff, was a fleeting trend. Margaret would chime in about the importance of a strong work ethic, a quality she clearly felt I lacked, based solely on my choice to wear jeans on a Saturday. They lived in this blissful ignorance, the king and queen of their own small critical kingdom, completely unaware that the company I'd been building for the last decade, Axiom Analytics, had just been featured on the cover of a major business magazine, the one with me on the cover. The reveal was nothing I orchestrated. It was far better than anything I could have planned. We were over for Sunday lunch. The usual commentary was in full swing. Margaret was questioning our decision to get a dog, such a commitment, and the hair everywhere. Bernard was dissecting my choice of car, not a lot of trunk space for a growing family. Then their neighbor, a sweet elderly man named George, stopped by. He was holding the magazine. Bernard, Margaret. I was just reading about your son-in-law, my goodness. Cover of Forbes Axiom Analytics, that's a huge deal, you must be so proud. The silence that fell over the dining room was more profound than any noise I'd ever heard. You could have heard a pin drop onto their expensive Persian rug. Bernard's fork, laden with a piece of dry pork chop, halted midway to his mouth. Margaret's smile froze, then twitched, then completely collapsed. They both looked at George, then at me, then back at the magazine. George was happily thrusting toward them. I just took a slow sip of my iced tea water. I asked Margaret innocently. She didn't even flinch. The backpedaling was an Olympic level event. Suddenly, my tech stuff was the industry of the future. My casual jeans were a sign of a modern, relaxed leadership style. Bernard, for the first time ever, clapped me on the back. Always knew you had a good head on your shoulders, he boomed, as if he'd been my biggest champion all along. It was comedic gold, but the true masterpiece was yet to come. A few months later, their own investments took a nasty turn. They were in a tight spot, and despite everything, they're a family. Sarah and I talked it over, so I made them an offer. We had openings in our client relations department. It was entry-level, mostly handling routine calls and data entry. The look on their faces when I formally offered them the positions was priceless. It was a mixture of profound relief and absolute horror. They were going to be reporting to me. And nod. I had stopped rehearsing my sentences. I let my accent flow naturally. Their opinions no longer mattered in the world I had built for myself. The workplace comedy that ensued was better than anything on television. Watching Bernard, a man who once lectured me for an hour on fiscal responsibility, have to come into my office cap in hand to ask for a personal day was surreal. I was wondering, he'd mumble, staring at a spot on my wall, if it would be permissible for me to leave an hour early on Friday for a dental appointment. I'd make a show of checking my calendar, which was completely clear. I think we can manage that. Bernard, just make sure you file the request through the HR portal. He'd nod grimly. The HR portal was his nemesis. Margaret was assigned to the social media team. Her attempts to use slang were legendary. She once drafted a post about a new product feature and described it as the bee's knees, and far out her team lead, a 20-year-old named Chloe who had purple hair, had to gently explain that those terms weren't quite current. I'd walk by the break room and see Margaret trying to understand the concept of a viral TikTok dance. The expression on her face was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. The water cooler encounters were unbearably awkward. I'd be getting a coffee, and Bernard would shuffle over. So he'd say, staring into his mug, big game last night. He has never cared about sports in his life. We'd stand there in silence for a moment before he'd mutter something about TPS reports and hurry away. Margaret tried to bond with me over office gossip, whispering about how Janet in accounting was wearing a new perfume, as if we were co-conspirators. It was bizarre and hilarious. But a funny thing started to happen. The dynamic shifted. The power imbalance that had once been so toxic was now just a fact, and without that edge, the need for constant criticism faded. We started having shared experiences, like the time the office printer broke down, and Bernard, drawing on his decades of managerial experience, actually knew how to fix the ancient thing. When the IT guy was stumped, he became the office hero for a day. Or when Margaret, using her sharp eye for detail, the same one she used to critique my lawn mowing pattern, spotted a major inconsistency in a client's data that saved us from a huge embarrassment. We started laughing together, real laughs, not nervous or forced ones. At a team lunch, someone asked how we all knew each other. There was a beat of silence, and then Margaret said dryly, "Oh, he's our son-in-law. We used to mock his pronunciation of water, and now he signs our paychecks." The whole table erupted in laughter, including me. The absurdity of it was the punchline. Family dinners are different now. The conversation isn't about my shortcomings. It's about Brenda in marketing's wild vacation stories, or the terrible coffee in the break room, or the time Bernard accidentally replied to an company-wide email with a question about his hemorrhoid cream. We're all in on the joke now. The mockery has been replaced with a warm, slightly sheepish camaraderie. They earn their keep too. They're a surprisingly dedicated employees. Their old-school work ethic finally applied to a context that matters to me. The moral of the story I've found isn't just that success is the best revenge. It's that sometimes the best way to deal with difficult family is to change the playing field entirely, to take the source of the tension and immerse it in a new context. until the tension just evaporates, leaving behind something you never expected, a genuine connection, forged in the fire of hilariously awkward shared experience. I got my revenge all right. But I also got something better. I got to see my father-in-law struggle with. Then the recession hit. It was brutal, especially for older traditional industries. We felt the pinch at Alara, but our niche and lean operation kept us afloat. The calls from Carol became more frequent. Her voice, strained. David told me in hushed tones that Mark's company was doing massive layoffs. The invincible facade of that family was cracking. A spreadsheet, and I got to help him out, and that ironically is far more satisfying. The laughter always had a specific texture to it. It wasn't the warm, easy laughter you share with friends. It was sharp, precise, a tool. You see, my in-laws, they were masters of a particular kind of social alchemy. They could take the sound of my voice, the cadence of my speech, the very shape of the words in my mouth, and transform them into a weapon. A subtle, elegant weapon, designed not to draw blood, but to establish a hierarchy. It was in the way my mother-in-law would tilt her head ever so slightly when I spoke, as if she were deciphering a complex code. Instead of listening to a person, it was in my father-in-law's helpful corrections, offered with a patronizing smile, always in front of others. It's pronounced this, dear, not dis, as if that single consonant held the entire measure of my intellect. This wasn't just a family quirk. It was a microcosm of something much, much larger. It's the assumption that a certain accent, usually one associated with wealth, and a specific zip code, is the default setting for intelligence and capability, that any deviation from that is a sign of something less. I've seen it play out in boardrooms before I had my own. I've watched brilliant colleagues from Lagos or Mumbai have their ideas subtly dismissed only to be validated moments later, when someone with a more acceptable accent repeated them. The emotional weight of it. It's a quiet erosion. You start to question not your ideas, but your very right to voice them. You feel the judgment not on your work, but on your being, on the story your voice tells about where you come from, and that story in their eyes was always the wrong one. It's a systemic barrier, invisible, but solid as a brick wall. It's in the job interviews where the unspoken question is, will clients understand you? It's in the subtle shift in a person's eyes when you introduce yourself, a fleeting calculation of your background, your class, your worth. My in-laws' living room was just a training ground for a prejudice that plays out in offices and institutions every single day. They weren't unique. They were just a particularly personal example of a pervasive sickness. Sickness that says how you say something is more important than what you are actually saying. That feeling, that constant low-grade humiliation, was the fuel. It lit a fire under me. I didn't just want to succeed in spite of them. I wanted to build something that made their entire worldview obsolete. So the company we built, it wasn't founded on the usual principles of profit and market share alone. Its foundation was a direct rebuttal to every snide comment, every condescending smile. Our primary principle was a simple, radical idea: meritocracy, real meritocracy, not the kind that pays lip service to diversity while promoting the same kind of people. We actively sought out different perspectives. We believed that the best ideas don't come from an echo chamber, they come from the collision of different experiences, different cultures, different ways of thinking, and yes, that includes different ways of speaking. Our hiring practices were designed to strip away bias. We used blind recruitment for initial screenings, focusing solely on skills and experience. But more importantly, we valued the story behind the resume. We looked for people who had overcome barriers, who brought a unique viewpoint to the table. We actively recruited from a global talent pool. Our team has voices from every continent. The hum of our office isn't a monotone drone, it's a symphony of accents, a tapestry of dialects. And we see. The email came on a Tuesday morning. My head of HR, Sarah, forwarded me an application with a note. This one's interesting: senior applicant, strong traditional background, but applying for a mid-level analyst role. Names: Mark Henderson. Says he's a personal reference. Mark Henderson. It as our greatest strength. The culture was everything. We instituted a rule, a simple one: everyone has a voice, and every voice deserves to be heard without interruption, without judgment. We fostered an environment of active listening. If someone struggled to find a word in English, we waited. We didn't jump in to finish their sentences. We created a space where people felt safe to be themselves entirely, where your accent wasn't a liability, but part of your identity, a badge of your journey. And the result was Innovation on a level I'd never seen in my previous career. Our diversity wasn't a corporate social responsibility checkbox. It was our competitive advantage. We understood markets that our homogeneous competitors couldn't even see. We solved problems in ways they couldn't imagine. Because we had a dozen different cultural perspectives, attacking the issue from every angle. Our success was built on the very thing my in-laws mocked. Irony of their request when it finally came was so profound. It was almost poetic. It arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet, desperate email. The industry they had dominated for decades, the old boys club that rewarded their particular brand of sameness, was crumbling. It was being disrupted by agile global inclusive companies like mine. The system that had coddled them and validated their prejudice was now shutting them out, and they needed an entry point into the very world they had spent years looking down upon. Their application landed on my desk. Holding it, I felt a strange calm. This wasn't just a personal moment of vindication. It was a symbol of a massive societal shift. The world was changing, and they were being left behind. Reading their resume was an exercise in seeing the gaps. It was a history of working with the same people, in the same places, with the same ideas. There was no evidence of cross-cultural collaboration, no experience with diverse teams. Their credentials were impeccable, but their experience was dangerously narrow. They were quite simply unqualified for the modern economy. The request was a confession, an unwitting admission that their way was the way of the past. My response wasn't driven by revenge. Revenge is a small, petty emotion. This was about something bigger. It was about equity. It was about turning their moment of need into a moment of education. I saw an opportunity to offer them a lesson. They desperately needed a lesson that went far beyond our personal history. I invited them to the office, not to my home, but to the heart of the enterprise they had once derided. Sitting across from them, in a conference room filled with the vibrant energy of my team, I laid out the new reality. I explained that their application, while impressive in a traditional sense, highlighted a significant gap. I talked about unconscious bias. I explained how the very attitudes they had displayed in their living room were now liabilities in the business world, that the ability to work effectively with people from different backgrounds wasn't a soft skill. It was a fundamental requirement for success. I saw the defensiveness in their eyes, the urge to argue, but the environment itself was my ally. They could see the proof all around them. The success of the company was undeniable. I felt a cold, still calm settle over me. I opened the attached resume. There he was, his entire career laid out in Times New Roman. His accomplishments, which he'd boasted about for years now, looked fragile and dated on the page. The cover letter was desperate, full of clichés about being a team player, and eager to learn. He had listed Elena Vasquez as a personal reference. The irony was so thick I could taste it. And then I made the offer. It wasn't a rejection, it was a conditional acceptance. I told them I would create a position for them, a real one. But the offer was contingent on one thing. They had to complete a comprehensive training program on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They had to understand on a deep level the harm of linguistic prejudice and classism. They had to learn about systemic barriers and the value of creating inclusive spaces. They had to be willing to be mentored by members of my team who came from backgrounds they had previously dismissed. It was a chance for them to not just join the company, but to truly understand what the company stood for. The broader message here is a call to action. It's a reminder that the world is changing, and clinging to outdated biases is a recipe for irrelevant success. Now, whether in business or in life, requires an openness to difference. It demands that we listen to the content of a person's character and the quality of their ideas, not the accent in which they are delivered. This situation with my in-laws is just one story, but it reflects a challenge we all face. We all have biases, unconscious patterns of thinking that we've inherited. The work is to examine them, to challenge them in our personal lives. Around the dinner table, we must call out the subtle mockery, the casual stereotyping in our professional lives. We must advocate for hiring practices and cultures that value every voice. It's about being brave enough to acknowledge that the way things have always been is not the way they have to be. It's about building a future where no one has to flatten their accent or hide their background to be taken seriously, a future where we are all judged by what we say, not by how we say it. That is the lesson, that is the equity. And it's a lesson I intend for them to learn, not for my sake, but for theirs. and for the sake of a world that is finally slowly learning to listen. The first time I walked into their house, I felt like Id stepped into a museum. Everything was polished wood and heavy furniture, portraits of serious-looking people. Staring down from the walls, you could smell the history in the air. A mix of old books and lemon wax. This was the family seat, the command center for a business that had been in their blood for 3 generations. They weren't just a family, they were a dynasty. And I was the outsider who'd married. They were always polite in that formal, distant way. They'd ask me about my day, but their eyes would glaze over before I could even finish a sentence. My husband Thomas. He tried to bridge the gap, but the chasm was just too wide. It was in the little things, the way his father Arthur would correct my pronunciation of a wine, or the way his mother Eleanor would give a tight, thin-lipped smile whenever I offered an opinion. But the real barrier, the one they kept circling back to, was my voice. I grew up a few hundred miles away, in a different part of the country. My accent isn't strong, but it's there, a certain cadence, a different way of rounding vowels to them. It was a mark of being common, unrefined. We'd be at the dinner table, the whole family gathered, and Arthur would lean back in his chair and say, that word again, dear, the one for the what do you call it, the large piece of fabric on the floor. Id say rug, and he'd chuckle, turning to his brother, here, that rug, it sounds so quaint. And they'd all share a look, a silent agreement that I was an amusing curiosity, a temporary disruption in their well-ordered world. I stared at his name on the screen. For a long time I thought about having Sarah reject him with a standard form letter. I thought about calling him, hearing the shock in his voice. But that felt small, petty. Instead, I typed a reply to Sarah, schedule him for an interview, Thursday, 10 a.m. I'll take this one myself. The worst of it was when I tried to talk about the business. Id studied business management. I had ideas. I saw how they were operating, using the same ledgers, the same supplier contracts, the same marketing strategies they'd used for 30 years. I remember one afternoon, I suggested they look into an online presence, a simple website to reach new customers. Arthur just patted my hand. That's very modern of you, dear, he said. But this business was built on handshakes and reputation. We don't need to be on the what do they call it, the World Wide Web. He said it like it was a passing fad, like the hula hoop. Eleanor added, our clients appreciate tradition. They don't want things to be flashy. Then she smiled, but it's sweet that you try. That was the phrase that always cut the deepest. It's sweet that you try. It was a dismissal, a way of saying my thoughts were childish, that I could never truly understand the weight of their legacy. Thomas would squeeze my hand under the table, but even he was powerless against the sheer force of their tradition. The message was clear. I was married to the family, but I would never be of the family. My ideas, my voice, my very background were proof that I didn't belong. Y'all never be one of us, their polite condescension whispered. Y'all never be good enough. So I stopped trying to be one of them. The energy I'd been wasting on seeking their approval, I poured into something else. I started my own company. It was in the same industry. But that's where the similarities ended. While they were relying on handshakes and reputation, I was building a data-driven machine. I worked out of our spare bedroom at first, then a small rented office. I hired young, hungry people who weren't impressed by old names on a letterhead. We embraced technology, not as a novelty, but as the core of everything we did. Our supply chain was optimized by algorithms, our marketing was targeted, measurable, and agile. We listened to what the market was actually saying, not what they thought it should be saying. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Their company, Vance Sons, was like a grand old ocean liner, majestic, steady, but slow to turn. Mine was a speedboat, nimble, fast, able to change direction in an instant. I'd hear things through Thomas, who still worked for his father. A key client had left. They'd been underbid on a major contract. Their quarterly reports were showing a slow, steady decline. The market had shifted, and they were still trying to sell the same product in the same way, wondering why the world had moved on without them. Meanwhile, my company was thriving. We were growing at a rate that even I found startling. We were attracting investment, winning awards, becoming a name that people in the industry started to mention with a kind of excited respect. We weren't just competing with them. We were playing a completely different game on a field they didn't even know existed. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It was Arthur's lawyer. His voice was strained, overly formal. He asked if I would be available for a meeting, a discussion of mutual interests. I knew what it was. The rumors had been swirling for months. Vance Sons was drowning. They'd taken on debt to stay afloat, and now the banks were calling it in they needed a lifeline. The morning of the interview, I dressed carefully, a sharp, tailored suit heels that gave me an extra 2 inches of height. I sat behind my desk. In an office with a floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking the city, I had the HR folder on my desk, next to a tablet, displaying his application. The meeting was held in their boardroom, the same room where I'd first been introduced to the family, the same dark wood table, the same portraits of the founding fathers glaring down. But this time the dynamic was utterly reversed. I wasn't sitting at the foot of the table. As a guest I was at the head with my lawyer, and my CFO, flanking me Arthur, and a leaner were on the other side. Along with their lawyer Thomas wasn't there. He couldn't bring himself to be in the room. They looked smaller, older, the confidence that had once seemed so unshakable had evaporated. Arthur wouldn't meet my eye. He stared at the grain of the wood table, as if he could find an answer written in it. Alina sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Their lawyer did most of the talking, laying out the grim numbers, the terms of the acquisition. My company would absorb theirs, we would take on their assets, and in exchange, settle their considerable debts. It was a rescue mission, but there was no disguising what it really was, a surrender. Then came the moment the lawyer finished, and there was a long, heavy silence. Arthur finally lifted his head. He looked at me. And for the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes, no dismissal. There was just a raw, humbling shock. The realization was a physical thing in the room, their financial survival, the preservation of the company that had borne their name for 3 generations, now depended entirely on the person they had mocked, for her accent, for her ideas, for not being good enough. The empire they had built was being handed over to the outsider. When it was time to sign the papers, the room was so quiet you could hear the scratch of the pens. Arthur signed his name with a slow, deliberate hand. Alina signed hers, without a word. Then I signed mine. There was no ceremony, no handshake, just the soft sound of pages turning. But in that quiet, there was a profound seismic shift, a transfer of power, a transfer of legacy. The name on the deed might have stayed the same for a little while longer, but the heart of the company, its future, now belonged to me. After the acquisition, I had a choice. I could have been a conqueror. I could have dismantled everything they held dear and stamped my name on the rubble. But that felt small, petty. This business, for all its flaws, was still their life's work. It had employed hundreds of people for decades. It had a history that deserved respect, even if its leadership had lost its way. So I decided to be a steward, not a destroyer. We integrated the 2 companies carefully. We kept the Vance Sons name for the traditional arm of the business, understanding that for a certain clientele that name still held value, but we infused it with our modern systems, our efficiency, our forward-thinking approach. We showed respect for the old ways, while gently, firmly guiding it into the present. I offered Arthur and Alina roles as senior advisors. It was a position with dignity, a place at the table. But it was no longer their table. They were not the bosses. The decisions were mine. They would give their counsel, and I would listen respectfully, but the final call rested with me. I think in a strange way they were grateful, for that the weight of leadership, the burden of a failing legacy, had been crushing them. My taking over, as painful as it was, also lifted that burden. The real lesson in all of this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving I was better than them. It was about understanding what a legacy truly is. They thought it was about preserving the past, about keeping everything exactly as it was. But a legacy isn't a museum piece to be kept under glass. It's a living thing. It has to adapt, to grow, to change with the times, otherwise it becomes a relic. True strength isn't in stubbornly clinging to the past. It's in having the courage to build upon it, to honor the. I saw him before he saw me through the glass wall of my office. I watched him walk down the corridor with Sarah. He looked older, his suit was a little too loose, his shoulders slumped, he was looking at the floor, nervous. He looked up as Sarah gestured towards my open door, and his steps faltered, the color drained from his face, his eyes widened, moving from my face to my nameplate on the door, to the panoramic view behind me. It was a complete system shutdown. He stood frozen in the doorway. Foundation, while having the vision to construct a new, stronger future, their legacy was the foundation. But the building that stands on it, now the one that will shelter the next generation, that's mine, and it's built not on handshakes and reputation alone, but on adaptability, on intelligence, and on the courage to finally speak in my own voice without apology. The light from the chandelier was warm, but it felt cold on my skin. It was one of those long, polished mahogany tables You know, the kind that feels more like a stage than a piece of furniture. Plates of roasted chicken and herbed potatoes steamed between us, and the crystal glasses caught the light, sending little rainbows across the white tablecloth. It looked perfect, a perfect family scene. But the air was thick, thick with words that weren't being said. I could feel the weight of their glances, not hostile, not exactly, more like curious, like I was an exotic bird that had flown in by mistake. My wife Sarah. She kept the conversation going, a bright, cheerful stream of words, trying to fill the silence. Shed squeeze my hand under the table, a little signal, it's okay, you're okay. I was trying, I really was. I was measuring my words, slowing down my speech, trying to smooth out the edges of my accent. It's a strange feeling trying to edit yourself in real time, to pack away the music of your own history, because you're afraid it might sound wrong, out of place. Sarah's father Robert was telling a story about a business trip to London. He was mimicking the accent, a terribly posh and exaggerated thing, and everyone was laughing. Her mother Margaret was dabbing her mouth with a napkin, her laughter, a light tinkling sound. And then Robert finished his story, and there was a lull in the conversation. He turned to me, his eyes crinkling in a way that was supposed to be friendly. So Arjun, he said, leaning forward, tell us about your family back home. You're from, where was it again? Mumbai, I said. I kept my voice even, calm. Right, Mumbai. And what does your father do? He was a teacher, I said. He taught history. Robert nodded, a slow, thoughtful nod. A teacher, how noble. He said it like it was a quaint, old-fashioned thing. Then he smiled. You'll have to say something for us in your language. I just love the sound of it, it's so rhythmic. My accent was their favorite topic. I came here for David from a city they couldn't find on a map. I brought my degrees, my love for their son, and the soft melodic lilt of my homeland that clung to my English like a familiar scent to them. It was a flaw to be corrected. A dinner table wasn't for sharing stories, it was a pronunciation clinic. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice even and professional, please come in and have a seat. My accent, my full, unmistakable accent, filled the quiet room. I felt my cheeks get warm. It's not just one language, I started to explain. There are many. Oh, just a phrase, Margaret chimed in, clapping her hands softly, something simple like good evening. Everyone was looking at me. Sarah's brother Mark had a faint smirk on his face. The spotlight was on. I took a small breath. Shub Sandia, I said. I tried to say it clearly, softly. There was a beat of silence. Then Robert let out a loud, booming laugh. What was that? It sounded like you were clearing your throat. He leaned back in his chair and did an impression, a garbled, guttural noise that bore no resemblance to the words I'd spoken. Shubshandia, goodness. Mark started laughing too. Margaret covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking, and in that moment, the laughter wasn't joyful anymore. It was a wall, it was a sound that closed me out. I looked at Sarah, and I saw the pain in her eyes, the flash of anger, but she just said, Dad, stop it, that's not funny. The damage was done. I could feel my face frozen in a polite smile, a mask I had learned to wear very well. Inside I was shrinking. The beautiful dining room, the soft light, the smell of good food. It all just faded into a blur. All I could hear was that mocking sound, the distortion of my own voice, my own identity, turned into a punchline. I felt like a ghost at the table, present, but completely invisible, the real me, the one who grew up in a bustling apartment, where the sound of Marathi and Hindi mixed with the smell of my mother's cooking. That person had been neatly erased. In his place was just the accent, the thing they could laugh at. That night, lying in bed in their guest room, I stared at the ceiling. Sarah was asleep next to me, exhausted from the effort of the evening. The house was silent, but the laughter was still ringing in my ears. It wasn't just about that one moment, it was about every time it had to repeat myself at a coffee shop. Every time someone had asked me where I really came from, every slight, every microaggression, every patronizing smile, it all crystallized into one sharp, painful point. And a switch flipped inside me. It wasn't anger, not really. It was colder than that, more determined. It was a decision. If they were only going to see me as an outsider, as someone whose voice was a source of amusement, then I would build something so big, so undeniable, that they would have to see me differently. I would use the very difference they mocked as my fuel. The grind started the next day. We flew home, and I threw myself into my work with a kind of manic energy. I was a software engineer at a good company, comfortable. But comfort was the enemy now. I started working on an idea. I'd had for years, a project management tool designed for distributed teams, something I knew inside and out. He moved like a robot, lowering himself into the chair opposite me. He couldn't meet my eyes. He looked at my hands, at the diploma on the wall anywhere. But at me, Alina, I didn't. This is your. The next few years were a blur, a montage of two different lives on one screen. There were the lonely late nights, me alone in my home office, the blue glow of the monitor, the only light lines of code. Scrolling endlessly, the quiet click of the keyboard, the occasional sip of cold coffee. I'd look at the clock. And it would be 3 in the morning. The world outside was silent. I'd stretch my aching back and just keep going. Then there was the other life, the one I saw through a screen, video calls with Sarah Shedby at her parents' house. For a holiday, for a birthday party, I'd see the warm glow of their fireplace, hear the laughter in the background. They'd all be gathered around opening presents, eating cake. And I'd be in my office, a tiny face in a box on a tablet screen. I'm sorry, I can't be there. I'd say, this deal, it's crucial. Sarah would smile. But I could see the disappointment in her eyes. I know, I miss you. I missed so much. I missed Christmases and Thanksgivings. I missed quiet weekends. I sacrificed time with my wife, the woman I loved, all for this thing. I was building this monument to my own pride. It was a brutal, lonely trade. But every time I felt like quitting, I'd remember that dinner table. I'd hear the laughter and I'd go back to work. There were small victories: securing the first round of funding, hiring our first employee the day we got our first major client. But it was always a trade. Success in one area meant absence in another. I was building an empire, but my own home felt emptier and emptier. The turning point was subtle. It wasn't a loud bang. It was a quiet click. I was on a video call with our design team, looking at the final mock-ups for our company branding. The logo was sleek, modern, a stylized A and V for Oravex. It looked professional, powerful. And as I stared at it on the screen, I had a sudden vivid memory, a memory of me, as a boy sitting on the floor of our apartment in Mumbai, tracing the elegant flowing script of the Marathi alphabet in a notebook. 2 different forms of beauty, 2 different parts of me. I approved the design, and in that moment it felt less like an approval, and more like a commitment to see this through to the very end. The day of the interview arrived faster than I thought possible. Oravex had exploded. We were the new darling of the tech world, and we were expanding rapidly. We needed a new VP of marketing, and the headhunters had sent over a short list of candidates. I usually left the final interviews to my HR team. But for this role, I wanted to be involved. I was sitting in my chair in the corner office on the top floor of our new building, reviewing the files. The city skyline sprawled out behind me, testament to concrete and ambition. I opened the next file on my tablet, and I stopped. The names stared back at me. Robert and Margaret Evans, Sarah's parents. Robert's consulting firm had hit hard times. I knew that. I didn't know he was looking for a new position, and certainly not here. This is Alara Solutions, I said calmly. I am the founder and CEO. I understand you're interested in our open analyst position. I picked up the tablet. Your resume is quite extensive. A part of me, a small bitter part, felt a surge of something dark, satisfaction. This was the moment I had imagined in my darkest, most driven hours. The moment of reversal. I looked around the office, the floor-dociling windows, the expensive art on the wall, the deep silence broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. This was power. This was the state. When my assistant's voice came through the intercom, Mr. Evans and Mrs. Evans are here for you, sir. My throat went dry. Send them in, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The door opened. Robert walked in first. He looked older. His suit was still impeccable, but he seemed smaller. Somehow Margaret followed, her posture perfect, but her eyes were scanning the room nervously. They didn't look at me, not at first. They were taking in the office, the view, the sheer scale of it. I saw the recognition dawn on their faces, the slow dawning realization that this wasn't just any tech company, this was my company. Then their eyes landed on me. I was sitting in the large leather chair behind the desk. The morning light was behind me, casting my face in shadow. I saw the shock register on Robert's face. His jaw actually went slack. Margaret's hand flew to her chest. It was a perfect silent tableau, the kind of shot you see in a movie. The powerful figure revealed the astonished faces of the visitors. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I let the silence hang there. I let them look at the nameplate on my desk. The simple bold letters ARJUNVASAVADA, CEO. I saw Robert's eyes drop to it, then flick back to my face. The accent they had laughed at was now the name on the door. Robert Margaret, I said. I didn't soften my accent. I didn't speed up. I let the cadence of my speech be exactly what it was. Please have a seat. They moved slowly like they were in a dream, and sat down in the two chairs opposite my desk. The tension in the room was immense. You could have cut it with a knife. Robert was trying to compose himself to put on his professional face, but I could see the tremor in his hands. We had no idea. Margaret began, her voice thin. Sarah never said. Sarah respects the separation between my work and our family life, I said calmly. I am reviewing your file for the VP position. It's impressive. The interview proceeded. I asked them questions about marketing strategy, about brand positioning. Robert answered, his voice gaining a little confidence. But he couldn't quite meet my eye. He was talking to me, but he was seeing the man from the dinner table. The one he imitated. The disconnect was palpable. He finally looked at me, and I saw it all there, the shock, the humiliation, the dawning horrifying understanding of every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every snide comment over the last decade. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been utterly inverted. He was supplicant, I was gatekeeper. And as he talked, something shifted in me. The thrill of the reveal began to fade. I watched them, these two people, who were my family, sitting there in a state of fear and shame. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To have them see me as powerful, to make them regret their mockery. But looking at them now, I didn't feel powerful. I felt sad. The office felt huge and empty. The victory felt hollow. This wasn't a reconciliation, this was a conquest. And what had I conquered? The approval of people whose approval, I suddenly realized, I didn't need anymore. The journey had changed me. The lonely nights had forged a different kind of strength. I stopped him mid-sentence. Robert, I said. The tone of my voice changed. It lost its edge. It became conversational, human. Let's stop for a moment. He looked up, startled. The tense music that had been playing in the background of the scene in my head just faded away. This isn't really about the job, is it? I said. We all know why you're here, and we both know what's hanging in the air between us. Margaret looked down at her hands. Robert's shoulders slumped. The professional pretense collapsed. That night, he said, his voice low, at dinner, It's okay, I said, and I meant it. It wasn't okay, but it's in the past. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk. I built this company for a lot of reasons, but one of them was because of that night. I wanted to prove something to you, to myself. I paused, choosing my words carefully, but proving a point is a lonely business. It doesn't leave much room for anything else. I looked from Robert to Margaret. You are Sarah's parents. You are a part of my family. That's more important than any job interview, more important than any point. The interview itself was a formality. I asked him standard questions about his experience, about his understanding of the industry. His answers were halting, fragmented. He kept tripping over his words. The man who had once mocked every syllable I uttered could barely form a coherent sentence. I didn't interrupt, I didn't correct him. I just listened with the same detached professionalism I showed every candidate. The room seemed to breathe again. The harsh, dramatic lighting of the confrontation softened into something more natural. We talked for another hour, not as CEO and applicants, but as people. We talked about Sarah. We talked about their struggles. We talked about my parents. I told them about my father, the teacher, and what he had really taught me about respect. We didn't shake hands at the end. Margaret stood up, and after a moment's hesitation came around the desk and gave me a hug. It was awkward, but it was real. Robert put his hand on my shoulder. We misjudged you, Arjun, he said. And for the first time, I heard genuine respect in his voice, not for the CEO, but for the man. They left the office, and I stood up and walked to the window. The city was laid out below, a maze of possibilities. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The final shot wasn't one of triumph. It was one of quiet reflection. The powerful chair was empty. The man was standing at the window, not as a conqueror looking over his kingdom, but as a man looking out at the world, finally at peace, with the reflection staring back at him. The journey had been about building walls, but the real change, everything changed, was about starting to take them down. When I'd gone through my list, I set the tablet down. There was a long silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the city below us. Alina, he began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. We Carol, and we had no idea. I know, I said. The things we said, he continued, shaking his head. He looked truly defeated. The way we treated you, It was unforgivable. I am so terribly, deeply sorry. It was ignorant. It was cruel. I watched him. I saw the genuine regret in his eyes. This wasn't a performance. This was the crumpling of a proud man who was finally seeing himself clearly, and he didn't like the reflection. Carol's brother, my uncle Mark, was the worst. He'd lean back after a few glasses of wine, his face flushed, and say squirrel Alina go on squirrel, and id try my tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar cluster of sounds squirrel id venture. The table would erupt in laughter, not kind laughter, it was a laughter that said you are not one of us, you are the entertainment. Mark would slap the table, no it's esquirrel, like you're choking, and he'd demonstrate his face, contorting. David would stare at. Thank you for the apology, Mark, I said. I leaned forward, folding my hands on the desk. Now, about this position, your experience with legacy systems is actually quite valuable. We're integrating some older clients, and your knowledge could be a real asset to the team. But I need to be clear, this is a demanding role. It requires adaptability. It requires respect for your colleagues regardless of where they come from or how they speak. Is that something you can commit to? He looked stunned. He was expecting, I think, to be dismissed, to be laughed at, to be given a taste of his own medicine. He wasn't expecting a job offer. You're offering me the job. I am considering it, I said, based on your qualifications. This company runs on merit, Mark, not on pity, and not on past grievances. Can you do the job? He straightened up in his chair. For the first time he held my gaze directly. Yes, he said, and there was a new firmness in his voice. Yes, I can. He started the following month. He was quiet, diligent, and surprisingly humble. He never spoke of the past. He treated everyone from the interns to the senior developers with a respect I'd never seen from him before. The revenge I had sometimes fantasized about making him suffer would have been empty. This was different. This was redemption, not just for him, but for me. By offering him respect instead of retaliation, I wasn't erasing the past. I was finally proving that it didn't define me. The power wasn't in making him feel small. The power was in having the strength to be the bigger person, to judge him not by his worst moments, but by his potential to be better. The true victory wasn't in his humiliation. It was in my own capacity for grace. The first time I met them at that stiff formal dinner, I knew exactly what they saw. They saw the accent, they heard the way I rounded certain vowels, the rhythm of my speech that was unmistakably from somewhere else. And in their world, that somewhere else was synonymous with a lack of refinement. My wife's family, they come from a long line of established people. Old money, I suppose you'd call it. Their sophistication was measured by the generations their name had been in the country, by the universities their ancestors had attended. Their value was in their history. And I arrived with no history. They could recognize just a future I was building with my own hands. They would make little comments, always wrapped in a thin layer of politeness. Oh, that's an interesting way to pronounce that word, my mother-in-law would say with a tight smile. You know, there are excellent courses for elocution, for smoothing out those rough edges. It can be so important for professional advancement. As if my advancement was being held back by the music of my mother tongue. My father-in-law was more direct. He'd listen to me talk about my work, about the algorithms we were developing, and he'd lean back in his leather chair. It's a fascinating little business you've got yourself into. He'd say, this tech thing, quite the trend. But is it a real industry? I mean, you don't build anything you can hold, it's all just ideas. He came from manufacturing. He built physical things, things with weight and substance. To him, my world was intangible, almost imaginary, a frivolous pursuit. His plate compared to the solid, respectable work of his lifetime. The clash wasn't just about language, it was a fundamental clash of values. Theirs was a world of preservation, of maintaining the status quo. It was about connections, about who you knew, about fitting into a pre-existing structure. My world was the opposite. It was about disruption. It was about creating structures that never existed before. My value wasn't in my pedigree. It was in my ability to see around corners, to solve problems no one had even defined. Yet my hustle, the immigrant drive they quietly looked down upon, was my greatest asset. While they were dining on their family name, I was working 18-hour days, building something from nothing. And through all their condescending smiles and their well-meaning advice about speech classes, I never said a word in my own defense. I just listened, I nodded, I let them believe what they wanted to believe. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew the score. I knew that the world was pivoting, and I was standing right at the center of that pivot. My quiet confidence came from the balance sheets, from the user growth charts, from the constant stream of acquisition offers. We were starting to field my accent didn't hold. Me back, it was a part of my toolkit. It allowed me to connect with engineers in Bangalore and investors in Singapore on a level that my father-in-law with his perfectly enunciated Queen's English could never hope to achieve. My company, it's in the AI space. We're building predictive models for global supply chains. It's not a little business, it's a complex system that touches millions of lives, that saves corporations billions of dollars. By anticipating disruptions, we're solving problems on a scale my in-laws couldn't even conceive of. Their world was a local one, ours is planetary. And the diversity of my team, the fact that we have a dozen different accents in our main conference room, that's not a weakness, it's our superpower. It means we have a dozen different perspectives on every single problem. We see angles. They would miss my accent. My background gave me a unique worldview, a resilience they never had to develop. They inherited their place in the world, I engineered mine. And the tide turned. It wasn't a slow shift, it was a collapse. The manufacturing sector, my father-in-law's entire identity, was built around it, cratered global competition, automation. 100 factors he never saw coming. The family business, the one that had been passed down for 3 generations, was bleeding money suddenly. The solid ground they stood on was quicksand. The respectable industry was a ghost. And the only industry hiring, the only place with any real growth, was the one they had mocked for years. Tech. I saw the panic in their eyes during a family dinner. The conversation was no longer about my pronunciation. It was hushed, anxious talk about creditors, about layoffs, about a legacy evaporating before their eyes. My father-in-law looked old. The confidence was gone, replaced by a bewildered fear. He had spent his life looking backwards towards tradition, and the future had finally run him. I remember one Thanksgiving, I was talking about my father, a history professor back home. I said the word philosophy, but I put the emphasis on the second syllable the way it said, in my language, philosophy. Mark stopped the entire conversation. What was that, Alina? Philosophy? He drew it out, making it sound alien and ridiculous. We say philosophy here, you know, like we speak English. The room went quiet. Carol gave a tight little smile. It's just so charming the way you say things, she said, but her eyes were. The realization dawned on them slowly, painfully. To survive, to have any kind of career left, they would have to enter the world they dismissed. And the person they knew at the very top of that world, the one with the connections and the influence, was me, the one with the uneducated accent. The humility required for that admission must have been a bitter pill to swallow. I can't imagine the conversations they must have had in private, the pleading from my wife, perhaps the final reluctant acceptance that their judgment had been catastrophically wrong. They came to me not as family, but as supplicants. My father-in-law asked for a meeting, using that word, a meeting, as if I was a banker, and not his son-in-law. We sat in my home office, surrounded by screens showing real-time data from across the globe. He was sweating. He tried to talk about my company in the language he thought I wanted to hear, using terms he'd clearly just read about online. He stumbled over the jargon. It was heartbreaking and a little pathetic. He handed me his resume. It was a beautiful, thick piece of paper, engraved. It listed achievements from 20 years ago, board memberships at clubs that no longer mattered. There was nothing on it about agile methodologies, about machine learning, about cloud infrastructure. It was a relic. I didn't gloat. I felt no sense of victory looking at him. I just felt a profound sadness. Here was a man who had built something tangible, who had provided for his family, who was now watching his entire world become obsolete. His fear was not of me, but of irrelevance, and that is a terrifying fear. So I did something else. I decided to bridge the gap. I pushed the resume back across the desk. This isn't what we need, I said gently. But that doesn't mean you don't have something to offer. I spent the next hour not as a CEO, but as a teacher. I explained how the tech world really works. I talked about the culture of continuous learning, of failure being a stepping stone, of collaboration over hierarchy. I explained carefully why my diverse team was our greatest asset. The different accents in my office, I said, they aren't a barrier. They are a feature. They represent different ways of thinking. Your way of thinking, the traditional, careful way, it has value too, but it has to be applied to new contexts. I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, not of the technology, not yet, but of the philosophy. He was beginning to see that the world wasn't rejecting him personally, it had simply changed its rules. I offered him a chance, not a senior role that would have been a disservice to him, and to my company. I offered him a position in our new business development training program. It was a junior role, an entry point. It came with a condition. He would have to embrace the culture. He'd have to work with people half his age, from every corner of the world. He'd have to listen to learn to be a student again. It was a massive blow to his pride. But the alternative was oblivion. He swallowed hard, and he accepted. The outcome wasn't immediate. The first few months were rough. He struggled with the pace, with the informal communication, with the constant need to adapt, but something shifted in him. He started to gain a genuine respect for the intelligence and the drive of the young people on his team. He began to see the elegance in the code. They wrote the brilliance in the solutions. They designed the technology, stopped being a scary abstract thing, and started to become a set of tools he could learn to use. Cold. I felt my face grow hot. I felt about 2 inches tall. I started rehearsing sentences in my head. Before I spoke, trying to flatten my vowels, to clip my words. I was sanding down the edges of myself to fit into their perfectly smooth world. The shame was a constant low hum in the background of my life with them. The real turning point was when he came to me after a project review. His team had successfully pitched a new client. He was excited, animated, in a way I hadn't seen in years. The model we proposed, he said, his words still careful, but now filled with a new kind of confidence. It accounts for variables my old company would never have even considered. The global perspective. It's incredible. He wasn't just repeating lines anymore. He understood. He had gained a new respect, not just for the technology, but for the intelligence. It required my intelligence. The last time we had a family dinner, the dynamic was completely different. He asked me questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. He didn't mock the concepts, he tried to understand them. The condescension was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-earned respect. The cultural bias, the intellectual snobbery, it didn't disappear overnight, but it was dismantled piece by piece through shared work and a new mutual understanding. They finally saw that my accent wasn't a mark of a lack of education. It was the accent of the new world. They were now struggling to join, and I had become their most important guide. The first time I met his family, I knew. It wasn't anything anyone said, not at first. It was the way his mother's eyes lingered on my mouth, just for a second too long as I said hello. It was the way his father's smile didn't quite reach his eyes when I told him what part of the country I was from. They were a fortress, his family, a closed circle of old money and older manners, all centered in this big echoing house on the coast, and I was the outsider who had somehow captured their son's heart. My husband David, he tried, he really did. He'd squeeze my hand under the table during those long formal dinners. He'd jump in to finish my sentences when he saw me searching for a word, trying to smooth over the edges of my accent. But his interventions always felt gentle, too gentle. He'd say, "Oh, Mom, you should hear the way Sarah talks to her clients. She's brilliant." And his mother would just nod her lips a thin line and say, "I am sure she is, dear," before turning the conversation back to his sister's latest vacation or his brother's promotion. The accent became their favorite weapon. It was the easiest thing to target, the thing that marked me as different. At Thanksgiving, his brother Mark would mimic the way I said pecan or while drawing out the vowels until it sounded cartoonish. Everyone would laugh, a nervous, complicit laughter. Even David would sometimes chuckle, a weak, apologetic sound. And then he'd pat my knee. "They're just teasing, honey." But it never felt like teasing, it felt like a test. I was constantly failing. I'd sit there surrounded by the smells of roast turkey and pine, feeling completely alone. The laughter was like a wall, and I was on the wrong side of it. David was in the middle, trying to be a bridge, but he was just getting stretched thin. After a particularly brutal Christmas, where his aunt had spent the entire evening correcting my grammar, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't change who I was, and I refused to keep apologizing for it. So I threw myself into my plan. I'd been a project manager for a decade, and I saw a gap in the market for a firm that specialized in sustainable community development. It was my dream, and it became my sanctuary. But that shame, that feeling of being less than, it became my fuel in the quiet hours after those painful gatherings. When David was asleep, I'd stay up. I had an idea, a small software solution for supply chain logistics. It was a niche I understood from my previous work back home. While they were mocking my accent, I was building a business plan. While they were patting themselves on the back for their comfortable lives, I was teaching myself new coding frameworks. The humiliation they doled out was like coal thrown I started working from our small home office. The door closed against the world in that room. My accent didn't matter, my ideas, did my ability to secure funding to manage timelines, to build a team. That's what mattered. David saw the fire in me at night. After a long day he'd bring me a cup of tea. And listen, as I talked about business plans and investors, he believed in me completely. In private he'd say, "You're going to show them all, Sarah, I know you are." But that belief never seemed to make it to the next family gathering. When his father asked what I was dabbling in, David would downplay it. "Oh, Sarah's got a little consulting thing going, it's keeping her busy." He was trying to shield me, I think, but it felt like he was hiding me. The company, which I named Veridian Solutions, took off faster than I ever imagined. Within 2 years, we were turning a significant profit. We bought a new house, or house chosen by us, not one his family had approved of. We had real financial independence. It was a powerful, quiet vindication. But to his family, it was still just my little project. His mother would ask if I was still playing office, and his father would make comments about how nice it must be to have a hobby that brought in some extra cash. The disrespect was a constant, low hum in the background of our lives. Then the call came. It was a Tuesday evening. David took the call in his study, and when he came out his face was pale. His father had made a series of disastrous investments. He leveraged the family's assets, their retirement, everything, on what turned out to be a fraudulent scheme. They were ruined, not just uncomfortable, but facing genuine financial collapse. The fortress was crumbling. The next few weeks were a blur of tense phone calls and emergency family meetings, from which I was pointedly excluded. I'd hear David's voice strained and tired through the wall. They were looking to him, the successful son, for a bailout. But we didn't have that kind of liquid cash. Our wealth was tied up in the business. The only solution, the only real way to provide them with a steady, substantial income, was to bring them into Veridian Solutions. The meeting was his mother's idea. She insisted we all sit down together like adults. They came to our home, which already felt like a violation of my sanctuary. His parents, his brother Mark, his sister Caroline. They sat on our expensive sofa, looking small and out of place. The same people who had laughed at me for years were now sitting in silence, waiting. His father cleared his throat. "Sarah," he began, his voice uncharacteristically meek, "we find ourselves in a predicament. It seems we've miscalculated." He couldn't even say the words. He danced around it for 5 minutes, talking about family sticking together and weathering storms. Finally, his mother cut in, her voice sharp, with forced dignity, "We need jobs, Sarah. We were hoping you might have positions for us at your company." The air went out of the room. I looked at David. He was staring at his hands. This was the moment. All the past Thanksgivings, all the Christmases, all the subtle digs, and the not-so-subtle mockery, it all hung there, in the silence between us. I could feel the weight of their expectation. They thought family loyalty would trump everything. They thought I would fold. I took a slow breath. "I appreciate you coming to me," I said, my voice steady. My accent, the one they'd mocked, was clear and firm. "In the quiet room, Veridian Solutions is a professional organization. It's not a family charity. If you're serious about this, then we will treat it as a professional arrangement." A furnace, it burned hot, and it powered everything. I laid out the conditions. There would be probationary periods for all of them. They would have to start in entry-level positions commensurate with their actual verified skill. Switch for Mark and Caroline, who had never held a real job, meant very junior roles. They would report to me or to managers who reported to me. Their performance would be reviewed objectively. There would be no special treatment if they failed to meet expectations. They would be dismissed just like any other employee. "This isn't a favor," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "This is a business opportunity for you and for the company. Do you understand?" The silence was profound. His mother looked like I'd slapped her. Mark started to protest, but his father shot him a look. They had no other options. They agreed. The real change, though, came from David. After they left, he finally found his voice. He came to me and said, "I have not supported you the way you deserved. I let them treat you poorly because I was afraid of the conflict. I am not afraid anymore." The next day, he called his family and laid down the law. He told them that if they took these jobs, they were to respect me as their CEO. There would be no complaining to him, no attempts to go around me. He was my partner first and foremost. For the first time, he had chosen a side, and it was mine. The first few months at the office were excruciatingly awkward. Mark resented having to learn basic software from an assistant half his age. Caroline struggled with the concept of a 9-to-5 schedule, his father given a role in client relations, had to be repeatedly coached on his condescending tone. There were moments I wanted to fire them, all but slowly something shifted. They started to see the scale of what I had built. They saw me in boardrooms commanding respect. They saw the numbers on the quarterly reports. They were inside the machine now, and they couldn't deny its power or my mastery of it. Professional respect, it turns out, is a powerful thing. It's built on competence, not on bloodlines. His father, after successfully navigating a difficult client negotiation I had guided him through, came to my office. He didn't thank me, not exactly, but he said, "That was deftly handled, Sarah. I see why you've been so successful." It was the first genuine, respectful thing he'd ever said to me. It's been 2 years, now Mark has actually found a talent for logistics and has been promoted. Caroline has become a reliable member of the marketing team. The financial crisis is behind them. We don't have big happy family dinners. The past is still there, a ghost in the room. But we have a truce, we have a mutual respect that was earned the hard way. David and I are stronger than ever. He stands by me without hesitation now. The other day his mother was in the office, and she heard me on a call with a major investor. After I hung up, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, I used to think your accent sounded unpolished. Now I realize it just sounds like authority." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. And sometimes for a family that built walls instead of bridges, that's the closest thing to healing you're ever going to get. They begged me for jobs, but what they really needed was a lesson in respect. And I used a nickname, Alara, for the company. I didn't want the connection to David's family, to the version of me they knew. The first few years were brutal, working a day job to pay the bills, then coming home and working until 2 in the morning on my own venture. David supported me financially at first, then with a growing sense of awe as I secured my first clients. There were moments of doubt, of course, times I thought maybe they were right, maybe I was just an outsider who didn't belong. But then I'd remember. The end, I was the only one who could give it to them. The first time I heard them laugh, I mean really laugh at me, it was over dinner. It was a small thing, a simple mispronunciation. I asked for the herbs for the roast chicken, but I said it the way we say it back home, herbs. The table went quiet for a second, and then the sound started. It wasn't a loud roaring laugh. It was worse. It was that quiet snickering kind, the kind that's meant to be heard. Her sister, especially, she had this way of covering her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders would shake, her eyes would dart around to make sure everyone else was sharing in the joke, and they always were. I felt my face get hot. I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks. I looked down at my plate, at the perfectly cooked chicken that suddenly looked like a foreign object. My throat tightened. I tried to smile, to play it off like it was nothing, like I was in on the joke too. But inside it was like a small heavy stone had been dropped into the pit of my stomach. That stone stayed there. Every comment, every little correction about my clothes or my job, or the way I held my fork, added another layer to that weight. "He's so quaint," I heard her mother say once on the phone to a friend, thinking I was in the other room. Quaint, it's a word that sounds nice, but it isn't. It means you're odd, you're a curiosity, you don't belong. I started to hear their voices, even when they weren't there, lying in bed at night, trying to sleep. I'd replay their comments. My own internal monologue became an echo chamber for their mockery. I'd be preparing for a presentation at my old mediocre job, and I'd hear her brother-in-law's voice in my head. "You think they'll understand you with that accent?" And I'd stumble over my words. I'd second-guess every point I was about to make. The desire to belong, to just be accepted by this family that seemed so polished and sure of themselves, was a powerful ache. But the more I tried to mimic them, to smooth out my edges, the more I felt like a fraud. The real me, the one from my hometown, was being slowly buried under a pile of their expectations and my own shame. I was losing myself. The turning point was a birthday party for my father-in-law. I had saved up to buy him a nice gift, something I thought was thoughtful. It was a book by an author from my region. He unwrapped it, looked at the cover with a blank expression, and said, "Oh, how ethnic," and he placed it gently on a side table, where it was immediately covered by other shinier gifts. That was the moment the stone in my stomach didn't just feel heavy, it felt like it was burning. I looked around the room at their smiling, condescending faces, and something in me snapped. But it wasn't an angry snap, it was a quiet, cold, and very clear decision. I thought, "You will never make me feel small again. Your laughter will not be the sound of my defeat, it will be the engine of my success." That night, I didn't go home and cry. I went home, and I started drafting a business plan. Psychology of it is strange, isn't it? Taking something negative, something meant to break you, and using it as fuel. It's like building a fire with the very things people throw at you to extinguish your spirit. I stopped trying to hide my accent, I started leaning into it. It became my signature, it was the sound of my determination when things got tough. And they did constantly. I had a secret weapon during those late nights when I was exhausted, and the numbers weren't adding up, and I thought about giving up.